Welcome to Choose the Bear, a podcast for people living single and or child-free, or who are just curious about a life built on independence, intention, and joy. Because being single and child-free isn't a phase, it's a path. I'm your host, Kat Calvin. Let's get into it. At least 10 years ago, I read The Widow Clicquot by Tilar Mazzeo, and I found a new hero. I have found so much inspiration and motivation in this book from this extraordinary woman. And when I started this podcast, I knew that I wanted to have Tilar on. And I am so thrilled and honored that she joined me and that we were able to talk about this incredible woman and also others. She introduced me to a new amazing woman that I am going to study, and Tilar has another book coming out about yet another one. She's amazing, and even Tilar's own life and how she took the leap and became an author, and just she's awesome. And I think that you, after listening to this, may do as I do and buy Widow Clicquot whenever you want to celebrate a great success in your life, because I like to honor my great successes by drinking the champagne made by a really extraordinary woman who was absolutely fearless and audacious and extraordinary. And so I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you find as much to love about Barbe-Nicole Clicquot Ponsardin as I did. So enjoy. Well, hello, everyone. Today is a thrilling day for me. We are talking to the author of a book that I read more than 10 years ago and immediately fell in love with. I immediately discovered a new hero who I had just through all of these years. I think about her all the time. I'm such a fan. I geek out. The second that I knew I wanted to make this podcast, I was like, I have to talk about the Widow Clicquot. So I'm so thrilled to have the brilliant Tilar Mazzeo on to talk about her wonderful book and the absolutely incredible Barbe-Nicole Clicquot Ponsardin, who she's just such an incredible, amazing, inspirational woman. And I'm so excited. So hi, Tilar. It's so great to have you on the podcast.
Hello. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with you.
So before I start, I always like to let everyone just define themselves however they want. So who are you and what do you do?
Well, let's see. I write about this in the Widow Clicquot, as you know. Started out as a professor and kind of for a long time was a professor. But my real passion was in wine. And I'd always imagined that I wanted to write books other than sort of academic wheezers. And so I had a job that I really didn't like in Wisconsin. No diss to Wisconsin. Wisconsin was great. Everyone's super friendly. I didn't like the job. And but I had two colleagues who became girlfriends, and we agreed that Widow Clicquot was our favorite champagne. So really that was the inspiration for the book, was girlfriends. And it was one of those things where it was kind of taking a chance on myself, right? You know, I didn't really want to be an English professor. What I really wanted to be was a writer. So that was kind of how I broke into it. And I spent a long time trying to keep a leg in both worlds. And then in 2000 and what year are we in now? See, I'm dating myself. In 2019, right before the pandemic, 2019, I finally took the plunge. I quit teaching in the academy. So I am now a full-time writer. I have a really, really, really serious garden. What else? I still am studying wine and champagne. So yeah, I write and I do wine and I work in my garden. That's who I am.
That's amazing. Well, we could talk about gardening forever. I took a master gardener course last year. I'm still learning, but last summer was my first real garden. It was very exciting.
I've always wanted to do that class. Okay, we have to dish that.
It's really so before we even start sort of diving into all of the questions I have about the widow, can you just sort of give everyone just a little bit of a bio of who she was and what she did?
Yeah, so okay, setting is end of the 1800s, right? She's sorry, 1700s. Born at the end of the 1700s. She grows up into the 1800s. She's born in Reims, France. So one of the what we now know as a Champagne town, to a really wealthy entrepreneurial family. Her dad's a textile industrialist. And he's a complete political player, right? I mean, when the revolution is happening, he's a revolutionary. When Napoleon's in power, he's Napoleon supporter. He's definitely has his finger up to see which way the wind is blowing. And he decides that when she is a young woman, he's going to marry her off in an arranged marriage to his biggest competitor, a man named Clicquot. And so they make this arranged marriage between Francois and Barbe-Nicole. They probably have hardly met each other. She has no business education. She has no real education at all. He also, her husband, has no knowledge about the champagne industry. He's meant to go and run a textile factory, but his great passion is wine. So they get married, and he says to his dad, I really, really, really want to open a wine export business. And his father, Philippe, says, bad idea. You're in the middle of a war. Like, this is not the time to open an export business, son. But he insists. And so what happens is, because he doesn't know anything about the wine industry, they get married in this arranged marriage in the cellars underneath the city of Reims, in a wine cellar. And because he doesn't know anything, he goes out in the carriage every day to learn about the wine industry, and he lets her go with him. And it's kind of amazing story where they end up actually really falling in love with each other over wine. So the story then is that he runs the business. It fails. The rumor in town is that he committed suicide because he was so depressed that he had disappointed his father. That might or might not be true. There's some evidence that, in fact, it was cholera or typhus. But the fact of the rumor is probably the interesting part. So she's a widow, really young. No spoiler alert needed, I think. Widow Clicquot is the name of the book, right? Um, and her story really begins when she becomes a widow in her late 20s. And she says to her father-in-law, any chance you'd gamble the equivalent of $1 million of my inheritance on letting me run the business that your son couldn't run? And amazingly, he says yes. And she runs it for about 4 years with a business partner that he assigns to teach her the ropes. At the end, the business partner says, this is a disaster. I'm out. She goes back to her father-in-law a second time and says, another $1 million. And the second time, he lets her gamble that money. And there's this incredibly complicated, I mean, the other love story is really between her and her father-in-law, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they both don't want to let go of her husband and his dream. And so finally at the epic moment is that she has this amazing vintage and she has to roll the dice and see whether she's going to lose everything or emerge in triumph.
Which is one of my favorite moments. But
One of-
let's go back because, obviously Barbe-Nicole was wildly fortunate to have this father-in-law who, against all of the odds, especially at the time, really loved her and was willing to gamble. But this was in the middle of Napoleonic France, and Napoleon was really pulling rights away from women in France. So what was that like for her as a woman who is now a widow who and also has one small child? I'm who's trying to run this business, and yes, maybe is fortunate enough that she has this wealthy father-in-law who believes in her, but is in this world in which women are being pushed backwards in time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she comes from, on the one hand, this incredibly privileged, what would be, she's not in the aristocracy, but she's in a very wealthy, what we would call upper middle class bourgeois family, right? So on the one hand, huge family wealth. And on the other hand, she's a woman. Yeah. And what she has almost no education, right? Her education is, how to do pretty embroidery and dance nicely and do cocktail parties, right?
Right.
Because that's all that's expected of her. Like, the expectation is that all she will do with her life is worry about pretty dresses, produce children, and, I don't know, maybe do charity work if she's really ambitious, but probably not, right? And do embroidery. That's the expectation for all that she will do. And the only reason that she's able to do it, because you're exactly right? Napoleon is not one of history's great feminists, I think. agree. It's like,
Understatement of the century.
so, right, the law says at the time that women in France, if they are single women, they do not exist in the eyes of the law.
Yeah.
There's a law called couverture, which says that women are covered by the, quote, empire of the father, is the way that it's put in English law. And that means that your father, your husband, your brother, whoever it is the person who exists in the eyes of the law and makes the decisions for you. There was only one category in law of women who existed in the eyes of the government and the eyes of the legal system, and those were widows, right? So widows were considered to be what was known as a femme sole, a sole woman, an only woman. But you had to have been married, right? You couldn't be 17 and just declare like I'm a sole woman, dad, right? So, and it wasn't that she was the only woman ever to run the first woman to found a winery in the Champagne. In fact, when we look at Moet, Jean-Remy Moet, who's kind of her, like if you remember the old Seinfeld episodes, he's her Newman, right? Do you know what I mean? She's
Yes.
um, and he's definitely her kind of arch rival. And he sees it that way. He's very anti-women. He does not think that women should be running, important businesses. And yet on his books, half of the people that he bought wine from were women. All of them were widows, and all of them were basically peasant women, right? So it wasn't that women economically who were widows didn't have businesses. They did. It's just that that wasn't something that a woman in her class position did, right?
Yeah.
So, and those women did it out of financial, need, right?
Yeah.
They had to do that, which is why the law allowed it. The law allowed it because a woman who didn't have a husband and had children needed to be allowed a way to make a living.
Yeah.
So, yeah, she wasn't meant to do it. If she hadn't had a father-in-law who had allowed it, he could have said no. He held the purse strings. But, I think if there had been another man in the family,
She would have been out of luck.
he would have been out of luck.
Yeah.
There was nobody else. And, she really loved his son and he really loved his son. And it was really hard to let go of the idea of a dream of a young person who you'd buried.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it interesting because we have this conversation a lot where I actually randomly just the other day saw an Instagram reel or something, I think along these lines of talking about in history, like women didn't work and they stayed home and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, that was privileged women. Like many women, and especially women of color, whatever, but women in poverty, they were always working. And I think the video is saying like, oh, you're the first woman in your family in history to ever live alone. It's like, no, come for some real privilege, because women have been living alone for a long time and working, and so I find that that idea, particularly for Barbe-Nicole, because widows, particularly of her class, could have been expected to either just be quiet and hidden away with all of your money, like the allowance your father-in-law gives you, or remarry, which is what we see many times among aristocratic women, is that they have to continually marry in order to be safe, in order to be allowed to go to court or be seen socially or whatever. Whereas women living in poverty, and of course it's France, so it's like they're going to make wine, right? But they're going to work because they have to, and they're seen as different people entirely to the men in the law. It's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea that women didn't work is a total class bias. Like that's a class blind spot. You're exactly right. What's really interesting about the thing about her and being remarried, right, is the other thing is, we always think about conventional standards of beauty as being 100% positive, right? And the reality is that Barbe-Nicole was not considered a beautiful woman. In fact, it was considered, a really quite unattractive woman. Again, we're talking about the cultural standards of her moment, but by the cultural standards of her moment, which were quite harsh about, women were really valued for how they looked. Women were, at her class position, were expected to be decorative objects, fundamentally, right? So here you have somebody who can't fulfill really in any good way the role that she's expected. She's never going to be a great beauty.
Yeah.
And, accepting all of those ways in which that is culturally constructed, Nevertheless, by the standards of her moment, she is not beautiful. And it is only because she is not beautiful that she is not pressed to get remarried. So, ironically, it is because the culture does not think that she is beautiful that she is allowed to be free after she's a widow.
So funny. That is a conversation that been seeing a lot happening right now. I'm about sort of ugly privilege and how women who are seen as unattractive are actually safer, right? Like you're just invisible, which means that men leave you alone and you feel pretty safe walking down the street and you can just focus on your job or whatever. Because we are unfortunately seen in society as you're either pretty or you're smart or whatever, right? And like that there are actually drawbacks to being beautiful. I did not realize that about Barbe-Nicole, but that's so fascinating. It's another one of those historical quirks that then allowed her to become this incredible
Absolutely.
was.
And for all of you, I'm a little older than you are, I think. I'm a woman well into my 50s. And I will tell you all that that's the same thing with being a woman in your 50s. Like once you're a middle-aged woman, it is astonishing the way in which you suddenly become culturally invisible. And it is the most amazingly wonderful, fabulous experience, the liberation of your 50s when suddenly you're not beautiful by the cultural standards of our day. You know,
That's amazing.
50-year-old women are not beautiful, but 50, 60-year-old women were out there rocking it with the freedom of like not being the subject of, we are not the object of other people's gazes any longer, right? And you can walk down the street and nobody even sees you. It's like you have this super invisibility cloak. It's a superpower being a middle-aged woman.
I love it. That's amazing. So one of my favorite stories, and this is, it's sort of a big moment in the book and in the sort of life of Barbe-Nicole, this career, is that she has sent along like a carriage of champagne, I believe, to Paris. So correct me if I'm wrong. And they're like, well, we'll see how they like it. But she knows that she has this really tight timeline because there's no FedEx, right? There's no FedEx. You got to send something but a wagon, and you hear back a few weeks later when the letter comes to you on the Pony Express. And so she knows, okay, well, if they like it, if I don't have another shipment there ready, they're just going to move on to something else and my moment will be gone. But if they don't like it and I send this shipment that I've sent, then I've just wasted a shipment. And she makes this incredibly bold decision, basically like, fuck it, I believe in myself. I believe in my product.
He's running the blockades. I mean, that's the other thing. She's like right on the edge of the law.
Right. And she sends it, and it's a huge hit, and that's what makes the House of Widow Clicquot. And it's, for me, like being, even now, to be that bold and to believe in herself that much would be incredible. But at that time, with everything she had against her, also, for people who don't know, and I recommend, well, I'll put in the links some really great books about Napoleon and a really good podcast. He's fascinating, but like Napoleon loved war. It was always wartime in France.
And he loved Jean-Remy Mouet. Yes. He's actively trying to help her competitor.
He was actively trying to help her competitor. And so there are so many things against her. And she was so bold. And did you ever get a sense when you were researching her of where that came from?
Yeah, there's that great quote that she has at the end of her life where, I mean, it's because it's weird, right?
I've got it bookmarked and I'm obsessed with that quote.
That's the answer to your question, is that quote.
Well, look, I'm going to read it now. I actually had it. I just moved and I need to put it up in my apartment in LA. I had this printed and like on my wall for years because I love it so much. So this is Barbe-Nicole writing to her granddaughter. And she writes, "My dear, I'm going to tell you a secret. You more than anyone resemble me, you who have such audacity. It is a precious quality that has been very useful to me in the course of my long life. To dare things before others. I am called today the Grand Lady of Champagne. Look around you, this chateau, these unfaltering hills. I can be bolder than you realize. The world is in perpetual motion, and we must invent the things of tomorrow. One must go before others, be determined and exacting, and let your intelligence direct your life. Act with audacity. Perhaps you too will be famous. I give the claps
I know,
every
like
time I say
chills,
that.
right?
It's so incredible. Like, if you're listening, this is why I love her. Like, imagine writing that.
Right. And she's writing that as a really, really little old lady. And she's like, it's a hard thing to be the writer, the author, and tell her story, right? Because she has this amazing period in her 30s and, late 20s, 30s, 40s, even into her 50s. And then she retires and she lives to be, what, 90? You're like, oh my God, like, how do I tell the story of the last 50 years where she sat there and does embroidery, right? So it's like you kind of, you'll all forgive me if the last 50 years move along at a quick play pace. But I feel like that quote is the thing where she says, I am sitting here as your grandmother, and to you, I'm a little old lady, and I sit in a room and I do needlepoint, and, you have no idea the experiences and the things that when I was a younger woman, I did. And don't mistake that I'm sitting here as your grandmother in a quiet room for the fact that once I did an amazing thing in the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's just such a great thing also about our underestimating people, women, as they get really old, right? I mean, that's the thing is it's like people have histories, and if you sit down and you ask people their histories, sometimes there's really amazing stories. But at 90, she's not still doing that. At 90, she's doing needlepoint.
It's so funny because I never connected that, but my grandmother, who I talk about all the time in this podcast and in the book, I admire her so much, but she is now 94. And she sits in a room and she watches MSNBC all day. But she lived an extraordinary life and was a really incredible woman, but retired the year I was born.
Mm-hmm.
So I've only, of course, ever known her as a grandmother. And so it's so funny because I could see her writing something like this. And it actually, maybe this is why I like the Widow Clicquot, because it's like, this sounds a lot like her. And it's true. I was just having a conversation with a different podcast guest about the people that we are, and then when we move into different stages of our lives, people who only know us as that person. And in her context, it was that when women get married and then move to a new place, people only know them as their married selves, and they don't know the whole woman they were before. But it's so interesting thinking about women like the Widow Clicquot or my grandmother or all these little ladies who we see, and we're just like, oh, aren't they just so cute? It's like, no, she was a trailblazer. She was amazing. And just because you only know her as grandma, she was this whole extraordinary woman before you knew her. I never connected that, but it makes me, well, grateful for people like you who write books about these women so that we do see them for who they truly fully were.
And that's, I think, the secret she's telling her grandchild,
Yeah.
right? The thing is, people have secrets. You have to ask people their secrets, and sometimes the secrets are the secrets of their earlier lives, right? Of their lives when they, had more energy than they have at 94, right?
Yeah.
The other thing, and it goes back to the gardening. I'm sure you know it. You know that essay, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens?
No, but I'm gonna look it up.
Oh, okay. I have an essay you have to read. It's called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, and I'm trying to remember now. Is it? I almost think it's Alice Walker who wrote it. Is it?
Oh,
Well, do a quick Google. Hold on. I just have to do a really quick Google. In Search of Our Mother's Gardens is and I'll tell you about it. Our Mother's Gardens. I got
life
on the podcast. It is by Alice Walker.
Okay.
Search of Our Mother's Gardens. I was sure I had that right. So what it is it's essay, and she says, I think about what it means for this, this transfer of generational, sort of courage among women, and of the ways in which it passes down among the generations. And she says, I remember my mother, and my mother was this amazing gardener, and they grew up poor, and her mother didn't have anything, and she had to work, and she had kids, and all of these struggles that, most people in the world have. I mean, most of us are not born into trust funds in the champagne, right? And so she says, and I think about my mother's garden, and my mother was a woman who was not allowed a lot of scope. She wasn't allowed great artistry. She wasn't allowed to have a brilliant career in a corner office. And so what she did is her art was her garden. And she had this amazing garden, and everybody would come around just to see my mother's garden. And my mother's garden now is overgrown because the thing is, the kinds of art that women have been allowed to have in our cultures, right, traditionally have not been pieces of art that have ended up in museums. They've been gardens, they've been recipes, they've been quilts, they've been, all of these kinds of pieces of domestic material culture that in some ways women put their heart and their soul and their artistry into, and then they end up not being saved. And what it's an essay about is saying, what would it mean to try to find again our mother's gardens and to have preserved our mother's gardens and to have, found a way to have recognized the soul and the artistry of all of these women through history who have not been, who were not given places in museums, who were not princes, who were not allowed to run companies. And for Barbe-Nicole, she very rarely got the opportunity to run that business.
Yeah.
But even then, it's a food and wine business, right? I mean, she wasn't allowed to be engaged in politics. She wasn't allowed to be involved in statecraft or changing the laws. What she was allowed to do was to make a beautiful thing that got consumed, right?
Yeah.
So if you haven't read that, especially if you're into gardening, it's like, oh, it's the most beautiful, it's a beautiful piece of writing.
I will.
If you think that your garden is more important than you think.
Oh no, it'll be linked in the show notes, listeners. And I can't wait to read. One of the things that you get throughout the book, and that I think there's so many parts of this letter that show I came up in the early 2000s in startup world and lean startup world. And I was really into Richard Branson and how he built Virgin, etc. Around the same time that I was reading this. And there's so many things that she says that you could hear at a Silicon Valley conference today, right? Like when she talks about the world is in perpetual motion. We must invent the things of tomorrow. We have to be determined and exacting, being bolder than you realize. And it's just like, she was so ahead of her time. And she's talking about these concepts about building empires and giving people things they don't even know they need, inventing the things of tomorrow. That is not the kind of language you usually hear from some random 19th century entrepreneur. And it's so incredible to me that she just got that out of her own head. I mean, she didn't go to Sorbonne or anything. She was just girl learning embroidery, but somehow
it was super
thinking. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think what could have happened if she had been allowed to get an education.
That's the thing. Can you imagine? I mean, right? And it's interesting. I mean, she didn't want her own daughter. She didn't let Clementine, right, go into the business. Yeah. I mean, she didn't think that her own daughter, who was, I think, quite, more of a sensitive, she just didn't think that Clementine had the stamina or the audacity. There's a reason she says that to her granddaughter, but not to her daughter, right? I mean, I think she thought that it was hard. She had made huge sacrifices to do it, not least of which was in her love life, right? I mean, if she had gotten married again, she would have had to have given up her business. So there was no way for her to ever have had a love affair again and to have chosen also to have that business, right? Although, there are some hints that she probably did fall in love with some people, or at least in crush with some people along the way, right? Because she was a really young woman when she was widowed.
Yeah.
But in the end, I mean, the law didn't allow her to have the choice. It's not like she could go and get married and then also run that business. And I think it is really important, like what you're saying, to emphasize how incredibly important she was as a businesswoman. I mean, she was not just some minor businesswoman in the 19th century. Later on, when they talk about it, they say that there were two great businesswomen of the 19th century. Madame Clicquot, who was known as, the Queen of Reims or the Queen of the Champagne. And then the other woman was Coutts, Angela Coutts, who ran Coutts Bank, although, mostly other men ran it for her, really. But she was the person who inherited Coutts Bank in England, which was the Queen's Bank and the King's Bank. And those were considered the two great businesswomen of the entire 19th century. But probably more importantly, in the modern champagne world, the things that she technically invented in terms of how champagne is made are still technically used. So it's not just that she established this massive distribution network and built this brand that survives today and that we all recognize, with the yellow label, but she also was the person who invented, both. She's the first person to make rosé champagne, And she's the first person to understand what we now think of as riddling. And all champagne, vintage champagne, is still made using the technique she discovered. And she discovered it. I mean, I love that story, right? You'll remember the story where, so after her great triumph, she steals the market share from Jean-Remy Moet. And then the problem is if she can't get more, she's going to lose the market share. And if you forgive the pun, she's got a bottleneck in her cellar, right? She can't get the product out fast enough. And the thing that's messing her up is how do you get the yeast out of the inside of your champagne, right? Because so, when you make wine, make champagne, you take a still wine in a bottle, you put in some yeast and sugar. The yeast consumes the sugar, produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, gets trapped inside the bottle. That's how you get sparkling wine, right? But now you got dead yeast inside that bottle. How are you going to get it out? So for centuries, right, the way they had done it is that they used a process called transvasage, which is just a super fancy French word for pouring it from one bottle to another. So they're like, yeah, like you got your bottle in your hands. They're like just literally like pouring it from one to the other. It takes a long time and it doesn't work very well, right? So she has the idea and says to her cellar master, Antoine, hey, like, how about you cut holes in my kitchen table? And we put it in the cellar and we just turn the bottles upside down. Wouldn't it make more sense to turn the bottle upside down? They're like, no, because this is France, right? No, madame, we've never done it that way, right? And she's just like, take my table down to the cellar and drill some holes in it. And if you think about a riddling table, all it is Madame Clicquot's table with a hinge in the middle so that it takes up less floor space. So she's really, I mean, fundamentally the person who's responsible for champagne becoming a mass luxury product, right? Without her, you would never have had that. So, I mean, it's like my little pitch for why Madame Clicquot is really, incredibly important in world history, at least in, the history of champagne and the history of business.
Which is massive. I mean, because she did build this huge business, this legacy, this empire, but also there's a woman's face on it. I probably have some here because whenever I get, oh yeah, I do. I have one right here. Is always the champagne that I buy when I'm celebrating any accomplishment because I admire her so much, thanks to your book. And so I keep the bottle caps. So I just, for my podcasters, pulled one out because I've got a couple on my desk because they're everywhere and it has her picture on it.
You've been drinking good stuff, I know.
Yeah, exactly. And but like just the power of opening this bottle of champagne from this legendary house and having a woman's photo on it is incredible, right? And like that is in so many ways, it's so empowering. And I was thinking about what other women remind me of her. And I would love to hear your thought. I really thought about Martha Stewart, who I also admire, who also was a single mother of one child, who built this empire. I think that there's a big difference in that Martha took something that is very much seen as a woman's art and made it into an empire, whereas Barbe-Nicole was in a man's world. But I see so many parallels. Are there any women in modern times who you look at and you see sort of embody the spirit of the Widow Clicquot?
You know who I'm a massive fan of, and I happen to live on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada, right? And so Pamela Anderson, I don't know if you know, is from a small town here on Vancouver Island.
I did not know that.
But yeah, no connection with Pamela. We just happen to live on the same island, right? But she grew up here on a small town on Vancouver Island called Ladysmith. And I mean, obviously she didn't start, a champagne industry. But I have to say, I have huge admiration for Pamela Anderson as a woman who got underestimated, I think, at every step of the way, right? I mean, she was valued. I think she's even said in interviews, she was valued as a young woman for her body and not for, the substance. And she has, she's turned out to be a woman of deep and amazing substance. I have huge admiration for her. That movie, The Last Showgirl, is such a sensitive and intelligent women's film, right? So Pamela Anderson, totally different. I mean, it's not, from Baywatch to Bubbly are two totally different genres, as it were. But I have huge admiration. Actually for Pamela Anderson.
Yeah. No, me too. And I think one of the reasons that these stories and remembering these figures is so important is, I was very fortunate that I grew up in a I come from a long line of feminists. And so I think Gloria Steinem were my first words, right? Like I always had all of these women who were sort of thrown at me as these great historical figures, but I recognize that that's not common. But it's so important for us to have these figures, for women to look at and see like, oh, this woman built an empire in Napoleonic France. I could do it in 21st century America, you know, and we're always looking for role models, and then we get really upset when we have, you know, sort of the Elizabeth Holmeses of the world, and we're like, oh, she's setting women back, but it's like, she really, because we have a woman who has been the example for hundreds of years. We have so many more examples of powerful women, and actually, the woman who kind of unseated Madame Clicquot from her throne was another single mother, right?
Yes, Louise Pomeroy is also
Exactly. And we all know Pomeroy, you know, and so like it's so important for us to have these stories so that young women today, and even older women who want to be in any industry can recognize it isn't just the last 40 years that women have been leading in business. Women have been leading in business since the beginning of time. And they have built legacies that you can buy Widow Clicquot at your local grocery store today, like anywhere in the world. That's extraordinary. And those are the women that we should be looking to realize like we've always been able to do anything without a man, although it helps if you have a rich father.
yeah, it certainly helps. Or, right. Any access to capital. I mean, that was the truth. She needed some access to capital, you know, but yeah, no, I mean, it's like, ironically, I don't know, tell me what you think about this. Sometimes I have wondered whether, because you're exactly right, women in history have done amazing things. In some ways, I almost wonder if like the 1940s, 50s, and 60s weren't simply a particularly dark age where women, you know, like women were assumed to be capable of less somehow in the immediate post-war World War II period, you know, like, you know, Rosie the Riveter, they go and they do these amazing thing in the war. And then I think what happens is, you know, the Second World War ends and suddenly there's this desire to put women back in the box.
100% what it was.
You know, the box that we all, and the thing is, it's because it's within our, you know, our lifetime or our mother's lifetimes, you know, it's one of those things where it feels to us like it has always been that way. And what if, in fact, it was not always that way? We just came of age at a moment where there had been an attempt to put women really hard back in a box.
Yeah.
So that we imagined that somehow the box were the contours of the possibilities.
Yeah.
Right?
It's completely that. And then we have the people who are making culture are men, and men who are certainly not going to look for, I mean, I'm thrilled that The Widow Clicquot is finally a movie. It took far too long, right? But like, they're not looking for great historical female figures from hundreds of years ago. And if you look, you know, they're really following that same path of, and I think I think now it's purposeful. I'm trying to give men more credit than they deserve. They're purposefully centering male stories and coming from this same place of, well, you know, girls, it's great that you've tried some things. And there's always a man who's the reason for it, right? Like, oh, it's always like the man who is like the dad who pushed them or whatever. And so every story and every sort of cultural reference that we get is of these like very weak women. And we don't ever get the stories of how powerful they were, how world changing they were. Or they're even, you know, minimized, like, you know, Coco Chanel, who certainly was an anti-Semite and had her bad parts, but also was absolutely revolutionary in the clothing industry and was significant in helping us win the war, right? And like, but no one ever talks about that. They're just like, oh, she was just like a woman who made clothes, right? Like, so even women who are so important in so many ways, we minimize them. And it was absolutely purposefully done. Like, thanks, ladies. You helped us win the war and you worked, but now the men are back. And of course, what they didn't realize is that they were just sowing the seeds of the women's movement of the 70s. But yeah, it's all of these history and these figures. I mean, I've never heard of Angela Coots, and I like have been reading these stories forever. I went to a women's college, and there's still these powerful women that I haven't heard of that I have to read books from, and yet we have to this day young women who really believe the fallacy that, it's hard, obviously it's harder for women to do things, but that there are limitations that they can't overcome. When the reality from history is that there are no limitations that women have ever not overcome,
Women do what they have, what women do, what has to get done.
what has to get done.
Great is you just do what you just keep carrying on. Like it's shit has to get done, and women often head to do it.
And I mean, I love that you brought up the poorer women because, yes, this story and this empire is about this woman who was born into privilege, although privilege at a time when there still was very little for her. But there were also a lot of poor women running their own businesses and selling wine to the biggest champagne house in the world so that they could survive, right? Like, this is a story about a lot of women making their own way in a world that was trying to make it impossible for them to do so. And I find that endlessly inspirational.
And that's the thing. So I've just finished another book because like what I write about is these stories, right? Like this is my thing. I write these books about, I write about what I talk about as hidden histories, stories that have, somehow fallen through the cracks of history. And often, sometimes those are spies and espionage stories. Sometimes they're, stories of, resistance movements, right? That had to be hidden. But generally, they're women's biographies. I mean, women's lives are hidden in certain ways because nobody thought that it was worth saving. With Madame Clicquot, we don't have her letters because either she didn't think that her own personal letters were worth saving or somebody else didn't, right? Nobody thinks that the thoughts of a woman are really worth saving. So for me as a historian, what I'm really interested in is how do you tell the stories that history didn't try to save, right? Like historians try to save some stories and other stories don't. So I've got a book coming out in December and it's about a woman who is a very, very young, it's called The Sea Captain's Wife. And it's about this girl, really, and she's very, very young. She's a teenager when she gets married. She marries a sea captain, and she is not from a wealthy family. Her parents are really impoverished immigrants living in the Boston area in the, beginning of the 1900s. And she falls in love, and she's not even 16 when she gets married, right? She's just 15, just barely 16. And she marries this sea captain that she's in love with. And they go to sea, and he collapses on deck because he has tuberculosis, right? Which, these incredibly crowded conditions. And what they want more than anything is they want to have a family and they bought a little piece of land on a river and they want to go and build a farm. But until they keep risking their lives over and over again for these journeys to make other people wealthy, right? They can't afford to start a family and go home. So it's this really modest dream, right? And, I was trying to tell this, and I tell the story of this woman, but one of the things I say in the end of it is I say to the readers, look, we have to accept that the record is really thin sometimes, right? I mean, it's probate records, it's, wills, it's, census records. Like there are moments where there are just this very, very little, and you have to accept that there are going to be big gaps in history. But if we're not willing to tell stories where there might be big gaps sometimes, then we're not ever going to have the story except of the wealthy, usually men, usually white people, usually upper middle class, usually European, right? Those are the stories you're going to get. Many of our families came over, whether willingly or unwillingly, in steerage, right? Nobody kept those records. And yet those people had lives and they did amazing things out of love and hope and, belief in their families and their future. And like, how as historians do we find a way to tell those stories? Because we have to find a way to tell them because they're almost all of our stories, right? Yeah. Like otherwise we're just telling the stories of this tiny, tiny group of people who already have all the oxygen in the room anyhow, right? But it's hard because people do get really super bent out of shape. Like, well, how do you know for sure? And you're like, well, how do you know anything for sure? You know what I mean? How do you know that, how do you know that what Napoleon says is true? Like, how do you know? Right? How do you know the president tells the truth always? Just
no. No, that is true. I would love to have you back in December to talk about the Sea Captain's
That'd
Wife.
be great.
Very
Okay.
excited about that. I know you also wrote a book about Mary Shelley, which is on my list. I'm so thrilled. Thank you, for writing this book. It really was discovering Barbe-Nicole was really instrumental for me. And she has been a very inspirational figure for me as I've gone through my own entrepreneurial journey and etc. So thank you so much for writing this book. And thank you for coming on. I'm thrilled. You were one of my like top 3 people. Is when I launched this podcast, I was like, I have too hard to talk about this book. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you for continuing to write these hidden stories about women. You need as many of them as we can get.
And if anybody has great stories out there and they want to send me an email, just remember, I'm always looking for hidden stories. So
there you go.
As you hear about amazing women doing amazing things we haven't heard about.
Yes. Well, now I want your book about Angela Coutts.
I don't have a book about Angela Coutts.
I know, but you got to write one.
I know. I've tried. And I haven't been able to get a book contract to do it because they say not enough people know who a Coutts Bank is. So I've tried.
Ew.
Oh, boo is right.
Wow.
Other woman that I've wanted to write a biography about that I cannot get a press to take is there's the woman who was from Vancouver Island named Frances Oldham Kelsey, who is the who prevented thalidomide from being approved in the United States and is the reason that in the United States, women did not suffer the children with the birth defects that happened in Britain.
You know what? I actually have always wondered, because of course everyone knows about that from the that show.
Yep.
Very good show about midwives. Yep. And I've wondered, it's so weird. I wonder why that didn't happen here. And now we know.
That's it.
Frances.
There was an amazing woman, Frances. She was a Canadian woman who married a scientist, and she moves to the United States, and she's given the job at the FDA, begrudgingly, because her name Frances sounds like a boy's name. They give her the job by mistake. They don't realize she's a woman. And so she shows up, and they've hired her, and she's under a huge amount of pressure to approve thalidomide in the American market. And she looks at this data, and she says, I won't do it. I'm not going to. And Kennedy gives her the presidential award in recognition of her freedom. Amazing story. But I've never been able to get a press to bite on that, unfortunately.
All right. See, this is why we need more women in charge of publishing. Speaking
Absolutely. I like it.
Man. So thank you so much. This is so great. I'm now so excited to read The Sea Captain's Wife. And just thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invite. Great chatting with you.
You too.
There.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Choose the Bear. The best way to support this podcast is to leave a review and share it with someone who might love it too. It really helps. See you next time.